The resources gathered from the land were and continue to be important for life in the Outer Hebrides. Peat is found in many places across these islands, as well as the rest of Scotland. It can be extracted from the ground, dried, and then burnt as a source of fuel. What follows are a few accounts about peat cutting, alongside other land uses such as crofting, from the past into the present.
Well, when I was growing up, my father, he was the school janitor of what is now the Comeniatis base. He was also a weaver and a crofter. So a lot of the land was used for oats, barley sometimes, potatoes and turnip, and grass for cutting for the animals. And he had cattle, we had our own milk, and we had sheep. When I was a wee girl, we didn't have electricity. And I remember when electricity first came, we only had one plug socket in the house. And there was a wireless plugged into that. Water came. Before that, we had to go to the well to get drinking water. And there was a well in the croft there with very, very good water. And water for washing clothes came, you had tanks for collecting water off the roof for washing and that. It changed days. My father and another man would cut the peats out on the moor, and the women folk would then go and lift them and gather them and put them in. When I was a wee girl, I remember us having a horse and cart, but it was always a tractor that brought home the peats in my memory. The working of the peats was very much a community, a village effort. People worked together and came together to do all those things. And I was just remembering, we didn't have street lights in those days, and everybody had a torch to go out at night. The land is not as much used nowadays. Our son, who has his own business in Lot, he does television programs as well. He's got cattle, including Highland cattle, sheep and a few pigs. He had a lot of hens, but they had to be, a lot of them died with avian flu, so he's only got a few hens now. He grazes his animals all over the village because so few people use the land, and I think it's something that we have to look at. Scotland has to look at crofting and see what should be done. A number of years ago we bought the land here. Oras Eiroch Housing, the Galston estate, is now in the hands of the community. It has 3 turbines that make quite a bit of money. I'm hopeful that the Galston estate will develop things.
Before COVID, hardly anybody was cutting peats. Well, the fuel prices weren't as harsh as what they are now, and everybody moved to oil, and it wasn't a necessity. It was more like something that was nice to have, but because everyone's got full-time jobs, they weren't going out and cutting the same. And then during COVID, everybody time their hands. It was like, oh, let's go out to peats, and they started cutting peats again.
We've got the highest level of fuel poverty in Scotland. We're at 40% of fuel poverty, so I think having that free on your doorstep is very, very valuable, although it is very controversial with like climate change. I did a survey recently about home energy on the estate, and there was a very, very high percentage of peat as their secondary primary source. So I think that's highlighted how valuable it is for people, and that more people are using it to heat their homes. Are still so reliant on it. I think it's something that has never died out. It's just in more and more demand.
We've, in the last sort of 6 months, written a policy on how we would like it as landowners to be done, and advising best practice. And if you are using machines to cut, there's a lot of guidelines around it. And then I think, well, you can't take something away from people. People are now relying on the peat for fuel. Can't take that away. So, but a lot of people don't know how to do it. They haven't got the tools to do it. So as an organisation, we put together a peat cutting course. We bought the tool, and I think we bought 8 of them, and I've sold them on. If they came on the course, then they would also get a tool so they could then go. So it's going to be an on, like, year in, year out kind of course that people can come on and learn about how to do it traditionally, to kind of trying to bring that traditional practice back in, because we know it's much better for the environment. I think that it's necessary for us to do it, because if we carry on the traditional manner, we can carry on with it. You know, we've got one of the best moorlands in all of Scotland. We've got to look after it as landowners.
Using a tarishka and doing it properly, that's what should get practised, and hence why that peat cutting course was put on, was to teach people who have moved up how to use a tarishka. Just a long knife, that's the only way that I can describe it. A lot of family value to it as well. It's like an heirloom, pretty much. We got one in the family, and my uncle has it. When my shen passed, it was traditionally given to the eldest son, which is my uncle. Because it's a family heirloom, like, you don't give it to other people to cut their peats, it only stays within that family. That's very, very clannish. But that's just the way that us type of people are. But if you don't pass on the tarishka skills, then it's only just gonna sit there and turn into rust. There's a novelty sitting on the tractor. It's, when you're taking them home, I feel like that was the excuse that they would save to coerce you into going. And being honest, I never enjoyed doing the beats. It's just something I personally did not like doing. As much as I hate doing them, it's a good opportunity to be with family that you might not have any reason to spend time with them. I know that sounds really bad, because you should be spending time with them anyways, but I feel like life just gets in the way. And I think the Peat is a good excuse to have that social aspect, and to spend time with one another, and have your lunch on the moor, and have your tea, and sit out there and just breathe in the fresh air, because it's like a pause of reality. From what I remember, you have a different feel to where our Peats are, which is in Skiggershire. It's just got a different feel.
It is something that kind of brings you together, you know, sitting round the fire. The house is cold, and any other part of it, everybody would be in their own rooms or whatever, but you've got one sort of central point where it's really warm. I think it does make people come down and sit round. So I think it's a positive impact. And I might be biased, but I don't think you get the same effect with coal or wood, just because of the smell and the fact that so much effort has gone into actually getting it there into the bucket to put into the fire. I have really fond memories of going through the process of going out to the moor like that. All the cousins there, aunts and uncles, grandparents, everybody would be out there, and everybody's working together to get the peats from the ground into the back of the trailer, and then it gets sent home. And at that time, we were usually collecting peats for your grandparents, because the tractor had to go all the way to Europe to dump the peats and then come back. It took an hour each time. There was lots of time just for playing out in the moor with your cousins. My life of living up here, because it has such fond memories from when I was younger. I can't imagine being in the house that I'm in without a peat fire. It would just feel so wrong. So I think that there is definitely a connection there. But then if I was in, say, my parents' house in Glasgow, it occurred to me to have an open fire, peat fire. You know, there's no connection there at all. So, you know, it's a strange one, I think. But it's part of living here.
Now, I remember my gran saying a couple of weeks ago that I was planting potatoes, and my gran said that she would do anything to plant potatoes, and she would do anything to go back to the peat. Because that was such happy memories, you know, with her growing up. And and she loved it because that's what they would do every single year. So sort of keeping that tradition up as well, although there's not a big crowd of us going out anymore. But yeah, it's just trying to keep it going. Within the past couple of years, we took her out in the car and you could just see her face light up because that's where she grew up and that was home to her. I like seeing her in her happy place. I think that that just trumps everything.
On the island of Scartby, down in Harris, we burnt peat all the year round. We needed to have quite a lot. There was a stove in the kitchen and there was a fire in the sitting room, especially in the winter, but for that you would need, I don't know, maybe 600-700 bags of peat. Now peat was cut on the island, but our family and a few other families, we cut the peat on an adjacent island called Stugay. And you had to go to the island. The only way to the island was by boat. And we would go turf the peat. Now most of the peat were cut by spade, not by a tharashka or peat iron. Some of it was, I think it was only one peat bank we had, and it was cut by the peat iron. But the rest was cut by spade because the peat was quite hard. Now, the one that was cut with the peat would dry very quickly because a couple of days after it was cut, you could lift them, put them together. You need two people while you're cutting, one cutting and one throwing. And maybe you would get a team of 8 or maybe 10 to go out. We would say go to our pits this Saturday and go to somebody else's pit the next day, next Saturday or whatever. So they work together like that. That's what we did as well. Well, we had, like I said, my father, mother, myself and my brother and my sister. Another brother followed. He went to school and went to university and things like that. So he was kind of posh, he wasn't. Anyway, that's what we did. And it was enjoyable to a certain extent, but you got fed up as well. When time came to take the peat home, we would go to the island, maybe with about 40 bags, fill the bags, put them on a boat, came back to Scartby, put them ashore, and then they were taken up to the house. Other people on Scartby who had peat, most of it, if not all of them, had to be ferried by boat because they were on the other side of the island and the peat there could be cut with a peat iron. And some would put 2 poles, one down at the shore, one up at the peat bank. It was quite a distance, but there was always a slope towards the shore. And they would put these 2 poles with sheaves where they could put a wire, a fence wire, plain fence wire with a hook on it, right? They would put a rope round the bag, hook it up, and off it went, down to the shore. So there would be one man up, hooking on, another man down at the shore, hooking them off. And that's the way it was done. And also it was done in such a way that you didn't have to pull the wire, the hook back. It went round and it came back the other way. When one side was going down, the other side was going up. Do you understand? The next bag was hooked onto that one. Same thing would happen again. So you didn't have to put these bags on your shoulders. Whereas on the island we had to put them on our shoulders and take them down to the boat. It wasn't far to the boat. And you always went there when the tide was suitable. You would never go there when the tide was going out. we always went to the island for the peat when the tide was coming in. And how many trips? I don't know, maybe 15 trips to get 600 bags home. So they were taken home and then they were used over the winter. But latterly we would get some coal as well, so we wouldn't have to cut so much. Cutting them would make me a day or 2 days. And then lifting them, we would all go as a family to lift them, and with the crowd, there was 4 of us, 6, my father and mother and the 4 of us. You know, you would go through them pretty quickly. Taking them home when the weather was suitable. You couldn't go if it was windy, because the wee boat was down in the water with the weight of the peat. But I didn't take that long. We usually do it, you know, maybe get it home in July, August time, when the weather was good. It was a must. It was a must. Peat had to be cut, because if peat wasn't cut, well, what were you going to have in the winter? But there was a shipping company on Scarpe called R. Cunningham and Company Limited, and then they started taking coals in. So people, it was easier, you would get the coal to the house, straight to the house. That was easier. We had a shed where we could put the peat into the shed. But here in Ness there was a lot of peat stacks. The peat stack was, and it wasn't close to the house either, because if you had it too close to the house, the rain was coming off the house, would go onto the pit stack, so we wanted to have a wee bit away from the house. But when they started on the pit stack, taking the peat out, you opened the end that wasn't facing the prevailing wind, so that it would be more sheltered. There was also a competition about who had the biggest peat stack, or who made the best job of putting it together. It was always just a local competition. Oh, mine is longer than yours, or mine is neater than yours. There were some people who could make a really nice job of a peat stack. They would put the small ones, the courants, they call them courants. They would put them inside, and they were really, if you had black courants, they were really good in the winter time. You could have a big blaze on in the fire. Also, you know, these courants were inside in the winter and it was snowing, or you know, you just had to go across to the barn and take them. After the fishing, there was a lot of fishing on in Scarpe. Big fishing boats with the 6 of a crew in each one, so that was a lot of men. If you had 10, 12 big boats with 6 in each, you know, that's 60, 70 men. But then these boats, people went to smaller boats, and only 2 of a crew, or just one man band. So there wasn't as many men to help cut the peat. And also, like I said, when the coal started coming, and then you can get the coal installed, where you can throw a bag in the boot of the car. That's handy. Even in this here, there's not so many. I think there's only 1 person in the village of Northdale cutting peat. Maybe two. Maybe 2. There's nobody cutting with a peat iron. It's all done by machine. We in Harris called it an Iron Mono. Iron Mono, which is peat iron. Here in Lewis they call it, I think down in the other islands as well, maybe down southern Nights, they call it a thrashker. There's 2 types of machine. There's a machine that can cut peat the same size as we used to cut with the peat machine, with the peat iron. There's also another machine, and the peat that come out of that machine, they're called sausages, because they come through a tube, just like a sausage comes through a tube when the butcher makes the sausages. So they're called sausages. They'll dry very quickly because they're compressed as they come through the tube, and most of the moisture is taken out. In days gone by, every household had their own patch you went to the same patch every year. That's what you did. You didn't go to a different patch next year because you had your own patch, and you went there and cut your peat. And if there were two patches that were close together, people would maybe have a wee fallout because you're coming through too near my patch and things like that. I'm retired, but a person that's working full time, going away in the morning, and some of them leave just at the back of 7 if they start work at 8, and they're not home till tea time. They haven't got time to go to the peat. Whereas in days gone by, in Scarpa it was fishing, and here in Ness there was some fishing, but there was a lot of tweed being done, and like that you could leave your craft for a day and go on, or leave your loom and go and cut peat for yourself or for your neighbour. Nowadays people are working, so they can't just say, oh, I'm not coming in tomorrow, I'm going to cut the peat. I can go to Stornoway now, I can buy peat, can buy bags of peat, and they come from Peterhead. If I was going to tell my father or my grandfather, oh, well, when I'm your age, I'll be cutting peat that came from Peterhead, they wouldn't believe me. In days gone by, you would never dream of cutting wood. There was no wood to cut, there was no trees. But nowadays, you can get it. There's one or two people on the island who can sell wood, and you can sell they sell bags of wood down in the shop.
Trust owns, as the owner of the land, but the grazing committees and the individual crofters are the ones who really manage the land more than the trust doesn't really manage any of the land as such. That's the grazing's, because the rights afforded under crofting tenure, it's very, very much the crofter's own, and the trust is set up. Half of the directors have to be nominated by the grazing committees from each of the villages, so there's always a majority of crofting interest, or a balance of crofting interest on the board.
Over the last few years there's been a lot more grants for trees planting and things like that, so a lot of the villages have forestry schemes up in the hills. It's possibly a wee more sheltered than down on the coast here, but other than that there's still quite a bit of crofting in the villages.
The only thing I would add is there's been quite a drop overall across all the islands in the number of stock. Maybe the use of the common isn't quite what it was. Maybe different to sort of Lewis areas. There isn't a lot of deep peat on West Harris, for example. The last forestry scheme that went through in Luskentide, they wouldn't actually allow planting on peat that was below, I think it's 250 mil now.
Yeah, that's good.
So it's really shallow. You can't peat plant on the deep peat anymore. So I know from some of the ones in Lewis that you wouldn't be able to plant on that now purely for I think the Sitka spruce that was being used grows quite fast, but then it's getting blown over. So it's more native woodlands that get planted now under the schemes that are supported. So.
A lot of people have stopped cutting peat, especially over the last 10-15 years. I mean, trying to get peat dry, you would start cutting peat maybe April, May kind of time, depending on how busy you were and doing the other things. And then you'd hope over the summer that it would dry, and then you'd take it home August, September, and you'd have it for the rest of the winter kind of thing for your fires and all. But I mean, the last few years have just been so wet, even in the middle of summer, that it's just been very difficult and just to get it home kind of thing. And also oil prices were very low as well, say 20-30 years ago, so a lot of people started putting in oil stoves and oil central heating and things like that. So if anyone did cut peat, it was maybe just for an open fire in the sitting room or something like that over the winter months, whereas before that it was the main fuel, but nowadays it's, as I say, it's very few people who cut peat. West side of Harris, as well, a lot on the west side would actually go over to halfway across the east coast to cut their peat, just north of Leaveborough. There's a glen there which is called the Clichty Board, and that's where most of, well, Scaristan, Borv, possibly Harrogate was. Harrogate was probably went up to Laxdale, a few up there. But the west side itself didn't have much peat cutting on it as such.
It's more pockets of peat rather than
Yes,
Atlantic
yeah,
peat we have on the
yeah.
west side.
You go for the deep pockets where you could kind of thing, so you go but try and get 4 or 5 spades depth of peat if you were cutting peat and that. But as I say, it's just very few people now cutting it. And again, I think in this day and age as well, that, you know, people are seeing the benefit of peat, you know, being left as well, because it draws in so much carbon, much more than people used to think it did and all that. So yeah, I suppose I think there's schemes to encourage people to stop cutting peat.
Yeah.
So yeah.
There's schemes up in Ness for peatland restoration, so that exposed bits of peat again, crofters can get money to repair that. So I don't know of any in Harris, but there are a few of those at the moment ongoing. You know, everybody cut peat, but not only that, the whole crofting, you know, it was sort of subsistence agriculture, probably right up until mid-70s, late 70s, where a lot of the food that was produced and eaten was on the croft, and you'd have the sheep obviously, but you'd also have oats and the croft. Each croft would have a milking cow, and that sort of changed quite quickly when it started to change. So the milking cows went first, and then, you know, a lot of the other, you know, growing the vegetables, growing crops for potatoes. Every single crop, you would never buy potatoes. There were so many potatoes that were literally coming out of your ear. And that has changed. It's that sort of self-sufficiency has definitely changed. And I hold my hand up as guilty as anybody. We don't do it anymore, and it's probably because it's hard work and it's a lot of graft. And as George mentioned, the weather has changed. It's much harder to get crops like oats or hay dry. So the bigger crofters are going for silage, which doesn't need to be dried, so that's completely different. And that doesn't help some of the birds that are struggling with corn cakes and things like that. So it's all connected, definitely. I can't see an easy way of bringing that back, but
No.
they had to work together to make it work. So to have a gathering, all the crofters had to get together and make sure it was done collectively. And I say, but certainly in Lewis, the peat cutting was a shared activity as well.
5 or 6, a group of 5 or 6 going out to cut everybody's back, kind of thing, you know, you don't do it.
So that's changed,
kind of
and
stuff,
I think maybe that's for the worse. It's not for the better, in my humble opinion, but it's not an easy thing to roll back on either. So.
Again, I suppose one of the major things that Trust did was the housing at the back there, you know, like with a lot of rural areas, which a lot of the young folk were going away and, you know, even going to the mainland and not coming back and things like that. And of course a lot of it is to do with jobs, but a lot of it's also to do with housing, that people just can't afford houses anymore here. The land prices, you know, for fuse and things like that are just shot up over the last 20 years especially. I mean, 25, 30 years ago you'd sell a few for about 10,000, 15,000 pounds, and now it's 100 to 150,000 pounds, depending on where it is. And that's just in 10 years, and you know, no local families are able to afford, you know, to say that. So as I say, that, you know, the Trust building the houses up the back just behind us here was a major positive, you know, and they are pretty much more or less local families who are living in them, you know, and so that was a huge help,
There was a really good scheme in the islands, crofter building grant scheme. Every crofter was eligible for a very significant grant. And back in the day, sort of up to 30 years ago, each crofter, someone who acquired a croft, could quite easily get a grant and loan, and it was a government-backed loan, not a commercial mortgage, so it was basically a bond that was in place for 40 years after the house was built. And that built probably about 180 to 100 houses a year in the Outer Hebrides. That scheme's been whittled away to almost nothing, and unfortunately the costs of building houses now are astronomical. Really, really difficult to build, self-built, because of the new technologies required, and so that's also gone, which makes it even harder for younger people to build their own houses. So.
It's almost twice as much to build on the island as it is this equivalent house on the mainland. Respect for the people coming in, to respect where you're coming to, kind of thing. And, it's not a kind of free for all. It is still quite a crofting community, and there are sheep and all that, and one of the major problems we have is the amount of dogs that are coming in, and the tourism and that, whereas again 15, 20 years ago you might have seen a couple of tourists a week with a dog going through, which was kind of strange to see. Now it's every day you're seeing almost every tourist has dogs, and some are keeping them on leads, some are not keeping them on leads. And I think because Scotland's free right to roam, I think the dogs are right to roam as well, but they don't. And I think that's one of the biggest problems we have, with visitors or whatever.
It's noticeable. You mentioned today the number of people who now have dogs. It's really quite.
Yes,
and to the extent that they've now introduced a limit on the number that they've called a ferry, because there was too many, congregating, so you've got to book your dog on. So. I don't know what's behind, but everybody seems to have a dog or two in tow. So. And there are issues. There are certain issues in that.
And not just with the crofting, but with nature as well, because you've got ground nesting birds, which have been, around the Machar, and they're in the dunes, and they're trying to nest over spring and summertime and that, and with the amount of dogs that are going around, the birds are just being disturbed and they're not breeding. I suppose almost everyone's got some connection with tourism, whether it's full on or as a kind of second job or a third job, whatever here. So I suppose there's a bit of that, and if you start doing that as well, you probably don't do as much crofting, what I guess you would do, because it's can be quite labour intensive in that, but also I suppose over the last few years the weather, the climate has changed so dramatically that half the crofting work that you were doing 40, 50 years ago you can't do anymore, because you just, things like hay making and all that, you just can't, very difficult to get hay dry and all that and things like that. And so I suppose I think climate's possibly the biggest change to crofting as opposed to tourism in a way.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with George said. I mean, it's always been a part-time occupation. I mean, my father was Merchant Navy, and before the tourism, probably half of the working men in the islands were Merchant Navy at the time, going away and back. So it's that sort of HIE coined the frame occupational pluralism at one point, and that's many jobs some people have, not just one or two jobs. So crofting is sort of fitted in, and it would rarely be a full-time, maybe 2 or 3 in Harris would be full-time.
Yes,
like full-time crofters, I would have thought. Maybe.
And they would sublet other crofts in other villages kind of thing to have a substantial amount of stock and that, but the vast majority only have kind of their own croft, maybe a second croft, just to keep a small flock going, but as I say, it's very, very, very rarely a main job for anyone.
And the support for crofting agriculture is changing quite a lot this year and next year and the following year, so you now have to have certain biodiversity measures in place to actually get any support at all. So the food, that's across the board for all farming, not just crofters, so it's changing quite a bit.
I'm an artist and illustrator based out in Harris, and the islands have inspired my artwork from when I was a tiny child going out to holiday on Uist and Benbecula, which is probably what inspired me to go to art school in the first place. just the difference in the landscapes and the textures of the lazy beds and all the different flowers, the colours, the bog cotton and the wildlife. So when the opportunity came to end up being on Harris working in amongst the landscape, I took it and have a lovely studio here. So a lot of my work is inspired by going out and looking at the landscape and seeing how the lazy beds contour around the rocks and things, and how all the stones come into the landscape as well, and then you get lines of the beach, and then I look at the layers and how all the layers of colour and texture build up and create for me an image. The detail of what about here that makes the difference. I love zooming in and looking at the texture and the colours in the landscape, whether it's lichen or whether it's where people have been peat cutting and you get the lines of where they've cut, or stacking peat as well, all sorts of things like that. It's really zoning in on textures and patterns, the real thing for me that really inspires me. For me as well, the fencing and the dikes and things, sort of delineating the different crofts and things, that I keep in my artwork a lot, because the fencing is just amazing how it sort of shows the contours again of where the land goes in the distance. I think how it changes throughout the year is really important as well, because the winters can be long and can be quite dark, but within that you get days of just absolute pure clear intense light. Maybe in November or something, when the light comes through and it's really strong and you get those really long shadows. That's amazing, and just watching as the year changes. And then just now we're just about to get all the macro flowers come out, so you end up kind of almost by accident living your life to those seasons and the way the colour works and things. So I find that really inspiring. But I visited Uist and Benbecula all the time when I was small. It's just where our family went on holiday, and I think coming here all the time, there's a sense of the place and the sky and just being able to see so far. It really does. It gets in the system and makes it almost becomes a part of you. And although I hadn't lived here before, I've been here now for 9 years on Harris, still I always go back down to Uist and Benbecula because that landscape draws me. It's slightly softer, but living up here is, when you go away and then you come back, you realise kind of why you're here and why it's so inspiring from an artist's point of view.
This is a treishke, and this is what's used traditionally around here to cut peat. It's a two-man job, and one guy on the treishke and the other guy throwing it. Some places they have one different that they can actually cut and lift out on their own, but we're more sociable in the US and we like to have
Crofts have different bogs, so
yeah.
That's the bog over there. This is Walker's bog here. The Crofts on the road. Next one up, that's his.
This is the bit that hasn't been done or has been done previously. But when you see that bog's been cut all the way up there, and it's all replaced down. The turfs you take off the top are replaced down, and it just reverts to what it was, but it's slightly lower. People say damaging this, damaging that, but in reality, it's not really any difference in that and this. So that's the first one, and it all goes out to the top, and you try and leave them following each other in, so that you throw the first one out further, and then you work your way back in, bang them against each other, and then they dry, and as they dry, they contract, so there's space between. The next one then goes in a dike on the front here, and then if there's three further up there, that goes to the bottom. It's so important. It's getting less important, of course, because people are on to heat pumps and everything else. But if your house hasn't been insulated or was built before lots of the insulation came in, it's going to cost you a fortune to want heat pumps and everything else. And the reliability of them is, it's getting better, of course. It always will be as it progresses. progresses, but in reality, you know, you've got to spend a lot of money on that, and then you've got to spend a lot of money on it, you've got to spend a lot of money on electricity, and it's a lot of effort, but it's a tradition that people have carried on, and you know, cute people